What's up, gang? Welcome back to Redux Visions, where it's about keeping the Mediaverse connected from the past and present to the mainstream and obscure. Today we're going to be deep diving into the RPG genre with a bang. We're going back to 1998 to revisit one of Squaresoft's most unique and innovative titles of its golden age, the bio-horror cinematic RPG, Parasite Eve. This video is pretty much going to be a strange amalgamation of all the info and thoughts I've had on the Parasite Eve franchise over the past few months, from the book to the games. Now, I won't be going over Parasite Eve 2 or the Third Birthday, not because I have anything against those titles, but simply because I've never played them and they don't hold the same kind of resonance as the first game. Parasite Eve has fascinated me from a distance for years, as I never had the chance to play it growing up. For a game that has the rep for being such a strange, cool blend of Resident Evil and Final Fantasy, I don't know what took me so long to play it, but thank God I finally did. And what piqued my curiosity even more was finding out that PE was actually the sequel to a book, and we've done games based on movies, movies based on games, movies based on books, and even books based on games. But a game that's a direct sequel to a book? This is new territory for us. So I decided to make this document of because there hasn't really been a close look at the weird pop cultural osmosis of the Parasite Eve franchise, from its bizarre adaptation phase to its subsistence even past the series' demise. There's plenty to address. Unfortunately, there's not a plethora of information about PE floating around, and even less of it in English. But I'll be going over everything I've learned about this pop culture phenomenon, along with sharing my personal insights and speculations. But get out your mod permits and distribute those bonus points because it's time for some mitochondrial mayhem. This is also your spoiler warning for Parasite Eve the novel and game, along with partial spoilers to Control, Resident Evil, and the anime Angel Cop. If we're going to talk Parasite Eve, then we need to start from the beginning and its first iteration as HIDEAKI SENA's 1995 debut sci-fi horror novel. The title was so successful that SENA became the first recipient of the Japan Horror Award. It's a pretty wild story, and since the game did a decent job of synopsizing the book's plot, I'm just going to use those scenes, read the captions, and fill in some of the blanks for you. It all started when a scientist's wife named Kiyomi was involved in a car accident. She had been a registered organ donor, so after the accident, her kidneys were transplanted into a young girl named Moriko. Kiyomi's husband, a scientist named Toshiaki, had taken some samples of her liver cells and tried to culture them in order to keep her alive. Toshiaki ended up naming those cells Eve. The liver cells multiplied and the Kiyomi Eve mitochondria eventually took a physical form. This physical form acquired the scientist's sperm through a weird hentai rapey scene, and Eve tried to give birth to an ultimate being. Eve implanted a fertilized egg in the young girl Moriko, who gave birth to an ultimate being. By the way, the girl is only 14, so what the fuck, dude? What happened to this ultimate being? A mitochondrial rebellion. The mitochondria passed from the father didn't connect with the ones from Eve. It began to deteriorate, and Toshiaki held onto the dissolving flesh as they both burst into flames and died. Without going super in-depth, that's a very accurate account of the book's events. Unfortunately, the book is paced like a march through hell. SENA, who was a microbiology grad student when he wrote Parasite Eve, injected copious amounts of real-world science and medicine jargon, including painstakingly detailed scenes of performing kidney transplants and examining liver cultures in excerpts I felt went on way too long. I mean, they say write what you know, and SENA certainly took that to heart. I don't know, I just felt beaten over the head with textbook exposition at these moments. And then there's the many scenes of people seemingly orgasming at a cellular level to the word mitochondria. Okay, that's not what's happening, but it kinda is. In fact, if I'm being bluntly honest, this isn't that great of a book in terms of style, but the writing style may be skewed due to poor translation. It's kinda hard to say. While the execution of the story is serviceable, the themes and the concepts the novel introduces are quite fascinating. Reveals of the facts that Eve basically had controlled Kiyomi's actions on a subconscious level for much of her life bring up the unsettling thought of genetic fate, making you question your own actions and are they really yours? Or are we just organisms whose actions are all predicated at a cellular level? Another interesting taboo subject SENA tackled in this novel was Japan's view toward organ donation, which at the time of the book's release was not favorable. This was mainly due to traditional Japanese beliefs that the body should remain whole when it's cremated, and some saw organ donation as a kind of body cannibalization. Regardless of the writing style, SENA had something to say with his novel on a national level, and said it very well. None of his themes are groundbreaking in themselves, but to be able to address cultural philosophies, along with the concepts of existence and scientific morality within the confines of biohorror, is quite a feat. As for horror, I wouldn't say it's terrifying, but overall has an unnerving, subversive feel, and you gotta give SENA props for that. If you're a Parasite Eve fan, I do recommend checking it out. Don't expect much in action, but I'd say this acts more like Eve's initial journey, focusing more on her motivations and propagation through time. And it works as kind of a good villain backstory if you look at it from the lens of the video game. But with a story lacking in action, choosing to focus heavily on medical jargon and speculative science, Parasite Eve didn't seem ripe for, well, anything interactive. That is until the IP experienced some very bizarre circumstances that led to its fateful transition of medium. The time period between Parasite Eve's literary success and its adaptation to gaming would be an interesting one for the IP. But Final Fantasy VII's development, which began in 1994 before the novel's release, would actually be ground zero for PE's video game conception. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who wrote Final Fantasy 1-7 and directed 1-6, wanted FF7 to originally be a New York City detective game. Of course, this didn't mesh with the traditional RPGs the company had churned out, and even though FF7 was a shift from the norm, this idea was a bit too much of a shift. But Sakaguchi's want for this concept is most likely why you start FF7 in the very grungy, dirty city streets of Midgar before moving on to the more traditional steampunk medieval settings JRPGs are known for. FF7 came out in 1997 and changed the gaming landscape. JRPGs were the it thing, and Squaresoft's North American audience grew exponentially. It also marked the beginning of Squaresoft's golden age as it played with house money title after title, year after year, being able to innovate with each entry and take risks on new IPs. And there was still a New York City detective itch that Sakaguchi had to scratch. But along with the JRPG boom, another genre had recently emerged to the forefront of gaming.
No! Don't go!
Survival horror. Yes, the genre that seems to be constantly dying while also thriving made its pop culture splash in 1996 with Capcom's Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's called in Japan. And Sakaguchi wanted in on the eerie, atmospheric gunningness of it all. So he said, what the hell, let's make Resident Evil meets Final Fantasy with a New York City detective theme. But then came the IP issue. Sakaguchi got in touch with the Parasite Eve publisher Kadokawa to discuss purchasing the IP rights, and at that time Kadokawa was in financial dire straits due to a drug scandal involving one of their owners, so they were hot to trot to sell to whoever was buying. Unfortunately, there's very little in terms of info surrounding PE's development, but if I were to speculate, and I'm going to, Sakaguchi wanted to make sure the game appealed to a Japanese audience, especially since the New York City setting, characters, and much of the tone in Parasite Eve is built on Western representation in RPGs, which was a new concept in itself, but one fitting for a modern-day setting game. But getting back to appealing to Japanese audiences, it's clear he didn't buy the IP to appeal to the States because Sena's novel wouldn't be translated to English until 2005. But it was a smash success in Japan upon release in 1995, with a live-action TV movie already made in 1997 and a manga adaptation to follow in 98. So at least in Japan, it was a scorching hot IP for the horror genre. And I can only assume it probably had a larger hype cycle overseas than here in the States. But the purchase also seems weird because I can't tell if Sakaguchi is actually a fan of the story or just liked its commercial appeal. Because normally when adapting a book, you tend to consult the original creator either during the rights process or just to gather some insight or feedback. But Sena was kept out of the loop entirely when it came to the video game, stating himself he knew nothing about the story until the game was finished. It's just a weird set of circumstances we may never understand, but it's worth thinking over. Now, I'm not going to be going over a Parasite Eve movie or manga simply because their stories are virtually straight adaptations of Sena's novel, but if you like a super in-depth synopsis of the novel or movie, I recommend checking out YouTuber The Siege and his video From the Top, which I've linked in the description. But Sakaguchi had his IP, he had his concept, and he had creative freedom. So it was time to get to work. Sakaguchi may only be listed as coming up with the concept and being a producer for Parasite Eve, but it's safe to assume that with his amount of influence in the company and his level of involvement in previous games, he ultimately had final creative say-so on the project. Although I'd be shocked if much oversight was needed with the rock stars he had working on the game. Chrono Trigger writer-director Takashi Tokita would helm PE, performing his same tasks of directing and scenario writing, and the soundtrack was in good hands as Super Mario RPG composer Yoko Shimomura would grace the game with her music, bringing a hypnotically cool, jazzy, sometimes operatic techno sound that gets stuck in your head in the best way possible. And it may be one of the most unique soundtracks I've ever encountered. I've been searching for anything close to it and have yet to find anything resembling her ariatic techno-based stylings. As for the look of Parasite Eve, that would lie in the hands of seasoned graphic and character designer Tetsuya Nomura, who would bring our mitochondrial nightmares along with one of the most iconic characters of the PS1 era to visual life. If you're familiar with Final Fantasy art, you're familiar with Tetsuya Nomura and know that his artwork is gorgeous and tends to be of a very portrait-esque nature, and Parasite Eve's art fits that bill. I just wish that there was more of it. I was able to get a hold of a Parasite Eve art book that contained a couple of very nice character portraits and a decent amount of creature drawings, and the details on some of these are just mind-blowing. Especially my favorite, the Spider Woman. This creature in the game looks nothing like this depiction. Not that I needed polygonal spider tits, but it's just crazy to see the detailed version of these creatures in Nomura's original vision. And when it comes to Aya Bray's design, Sakaguchi told Nomura he wanted a female protagonist who was strong, sexy, and bewitching, and I think he hit the mark. She looks good in a dress, but won't hesitate to draw her gun and face off against a mitochondrial monster on date night. It was also kind of a big deal that Squaresoft would have a female main character. It was certainly a change from their normal Chad or emo RPG protagonists, and to this point in gaming, only two names really stuck out as strong females, those being Samus of Metroid Prime and Tomb Raider's Lara Croft. And let's face it, people thought Samus was a man until the game's ending, and Lara Croft may be the most sexualized polygon of all time. But Aya Bray walked that fine line of savage and sexy, bringing me to a speculation on inspiration, because there's a particular anime I think lines up well with Aya Bray's design and Parasite Eve's general story. The 1989 six-part OVA series is basically the template for Parasite Eve, with a coda cyberpunk and definitely more colorful language.
I've heard some bullshit in my time, mister, but yours is the best. Shut the fuck up, you self-righteous, moralizing commie scumbag. You make me sick. Oh, and another thing, unless you want a .45 caliber lobotomy real bad, I suggest you tell your friend over there to put that fucking knife down.
But you've got your strong renegade cop female protagonist who takes no crap from no one and goes it alone against a bio-enhanced telekinetic psychopath with a god complex who wants to wipe out humanity because anime? Again, because there's so little on Parasite Eve's development, this is just me theorizing through my obscure lens of observation, but I think you have to admit the similarities are there. And yes, the survival horror argument could be made that Aya was designed in the Jill Valentine mold, but I don't think Jill really came into her own as an iconic badass until Resident Evil 3, which came out after Parasite Eve, leaving Angel Cop as probably the only example of Parasite Eve being similar to, well, anything. And I mean that in an extremely positive way, because Parasite Eve's uniquities like its combat style and weapons modding system are kind of the glue that held all this together, and made it such a fun, different experience from anything done in RPGs or survival horror. Let's start with the weapon mods. Like a traditional RPG, you do pick up weapons and armor with higher stats as you progress through the game, but the introduction of tools and bonus points adds a new layer to equipment and stat customization. Bonus points can be poured into your ATB to speed it up, or into item capacity to, well, hold more items. But bonus points can also be used to buff up stats on your guns and armor. Tools take it another step, letting you transfer attributes and status effects from one gun to another, and it really gives the players a different level of control on how you want to approach the game. Some may want to make a dirty hairy hand cannon, while others may prefer to be machine gun maniacs. I chose the death from a distance rifle approach and made a fucking buster cannon. By the end of the game, I had a rifle with 90 plus attack, about 125 range, and 30 capacity. Not to mention the slew of attributes I attached. This is just my RPG gun nut way of saying my rifle had big dick energy by the time I was done. It's a really fun crafting system that makes you think strategically about your mod choices the further you get in the game. And to be honest, I enjoyed this feature so much, I'll admit I found myself going to bed thinking of weapon mods a couple times. But for me, that was just a sign that this game was something special. And special doesn't even describe Parasite Eve's combat system. I'd have to put that under awesome. I was hooked by the system immediately. Real-time RPG combat with guns and magic? I am fucking down. And with such a breath of fresh air from most RPGs of this era is the ability to move around the battle arena in between turns, taking up better positions to inflict more damage, or simply just getting out of an enemy's attack range. Speaking of range, it's also why I went with rifle in my playthrough, because the green vector dome represents your firing range, and the more range you have, the easier to do damage from a distance. There's nothing I don't love about combat in Parasite Eve. It's a system I would have loved to have seen in Final Fantasy games of that time, but it's also a battle system that kinda only works when you have a solo party member. But we would eventually get a blending of Parasite Eve's combat with a touch of Final Fantasy with Squaresoft's 2000 release, Vagrant Story, another cool Square IP that has sadly fallen into obscurity. But it's interesting if you take a look at Vagrant Story's combat and Final Fantasy VIII's character designs, because it reveals a bit more about Parasite Eve's innovative aesthetics and gameplay. Parasite Eve was essentially a proof of concept game or a tech demo. Final Fantasy VIII was set on moving away from the deformed character models of 7 to create less cutscene dissonance, and you can tell Parasite Eve's character models were used to represent where the look was going. And cutscenes were a big part of Parasite Eve's marketing, being touted as the cinematic RPG. I mean, by 1998 standards, absolutely. When you look at that moniker today, it's probably the one thing about this game that doesn't hold up to the test of time. But the tech demo aspect made total sense. With them already traveling so much uncharted territory with this game, why not use it as a testing ground for your true money-making franchise? But Parasite Eve wasn't just around to be a placeholder, and on March 29, 1998, the mitochondrial masterpiece would be unleashed, cementing a legacy in gaming as one of the most satisfyingly odd yet unique titles of not just the RPG genre, but the gaming medium as a whole. The Parasite Eve experience takes you on a 6-day action-packed journey as New York City super cop Aya Brea, as she battles an operatic mitochondrial monster named Eve who's hell-bent on humanity's extinction. Along the way, you'll uncover the secrets of Eve's existence and the powers of the mitochondria, and your nightmare fuel encounters consist of everything from sentient piles of leaves to fire-breathing T-Rexes. Aya is a bad woman, taking mitochondria and kicking ass all the way, and she'll do whatever it takes to ensure the holiday season is not our eve of extinction. Now, I don't want to give too much of away for those that have yet to play the game, and those that have know all the high notes of this survival horror tour de force. But Parasite Eve was loved by reviewers and gamers alike, and there was a genuine love for the character of Aya Brea, who had cemented herself as one of the most badass females in gaming to that point. And PE was so popular that it would get a sequel just a year later in 1999. But critics weren't quite as high on Parasite Eve 2, mainly because of its shift in combat style, and the game truly leaning into the indulgence of being a Resident Evil clone. But despite critics' average scores, PE2 still remains a title that fans of the series truly love, with some calling it a better Resident Evil than Resident Evil. So Parasite Eve had 2 positively received games on its resume. What was next? Well, years went by. Specifically 8. And it was in 2007 that Tetsuya Nomura expressed interest in reviving Aya Brea and the survival horror RPG, and Square Enix listened. Although virtually nobody from the original staff was working on this game, and it wasn't being made for consoles. It was originally going to be a mobile game that eventually became a PSP exclusive. It also was seemingly ditching the RPG element and kind of the survival horror element, instead opting to be a straight-up third-person action shooter. Fans did not like this, and they hated the story even more. And with its underwhelming reception, the third birthday would become viewed as the nail in Parasite Eve's franchise coffin. That is until the past couple years, with Square beginning to remaster and remake some of its beloved retro titles, giving Final Fantasy VIII a slight graphical enhancement and completely remaking their all-time great Final Fantasy VII, which totally implemented elements of Parasite Eve's original real-time combat system. This sparked conversation of a Parasite Eve remake, with Final Fantasy VII Remake producer Yoshinori Kitase even saying it would be a waste to not use the Parasite Eve characters in a future project. But these are rumors that have only begun earlier this year and have yet to bear any fruit. In the intro, I briefly mentioned Parasite Eve's subsistence past the franchise's demise, and I didn't just mean remake rumors, because when searching the video game landscape for anything like PE, there is a game that I feel lives up to being Parasite Eve's spiritual successor that I think we've been sleeping on for the past year. It might be that Control hasn't been out long enough for this comparison to take hold, but looking at a lot of the elements of it, you can reasonably call Control the modern Parasite Eve. A strong solo female protagonist with some vague sci-fi powers taking on an entity that changes people at a biological level. In Parasite Eve, it takes the form of spontaneous combustion, and in Control, they become marionettes possessed by the enemy known as the Hiss. Control, like Parasite Eve, also has a unique combat system that balances run-and-gun action with paranormal powers that evolve as the game goes on. It even keeps the RPG skill tree elements, and weapon mod shield upgrades are implemented in this game as well. Honestly, if you changed Jessie Faden's hair to blonde and her name to Aya Brea, then you'd have Parasite Eve Control. I don't think anyone would be dissatisfied by that. Seriously, someone make an Aya Brea mod for Control. Do it, internet. As someone who's fallen in love with Parasite Eve just on one playthrough, I understand how unique of a title it is, and I just wanted to let fans of the series know Parasite Eve still lives in spirit. And though it's not mitochondrial monsters you're facing, your want for something unique and awesome with RPG survival horror elements should be satiated. Well, gang, that was Parasite Eve, and everything I know about it. This was a really fun document to make, and I always enjoy trying to piece together how bizarre projects like this came to be. The bigger the mystery, the more fun it is. And Parasite Eve, I feel, will always remain a mysterious development cycle that we'll never have the full picture of. It's so strange for such a groundbreaking game to have so little information about it, but that's what makes every crumb we can glean that much more cool. I'm glad I finally decided to play Parasite Eve, and it's been surreal to explore this game during the hellscape year of 2020, as we continue our own fight against an invisible viral enemy that seemingly came out of nowhere and is constantly mutating and evolving before our eyes faster than we can eradicate it. Probably not the way Parasite Eve would like to be referenced, but shit, it is what it is. I hope this video did PE justice, and that if you've never played the game, hopefully it's intrigued you enough to give it a go. As I previously mentioned, Parasite Eve was called the Cinematic RPG, but had it been more blunt about what it is, I might have picked it up sooner, because in all reality, Parasite Eve isn't the cinematic RPG, it's a real-time, turn-based, survival, bio-horror shooting RPG, which sounds infinitely more awesome than just cinematic. For me, it's the variant, unique and in an undefinable class of its own. Parasite Eve is to Christmas video games what Die Hard is to Christmas movies. Essential and a yearly must during the holidays. Thank you guys as always for watching, and I just want you to know your time, support, and feedback are truly appreciated here at Redux Visions. I hope that this video was informative, but most importantly, entertaining. Stay steezy, gang, and I'll catch you on the next. But I hope that you've enjoyed the Document of Parasite Eve.
The name's Angel, but don't let that fool you. I can be a bitch when I want to.